There's a dark truth about the economics of immigration. Most people get caught up as to whether immigration is a burden or a boost to its economy. There's all sorts of contradictory statistics. In the UK, a low-income migrant costs the government about £500,000 over the course of their life. But in the US, the effects of illegal immigration over the next 10 years is going to be a positive $1 trillion impact on the federal budget. It turns out that both of these statistics are from good studies. In fact, both of these things are true in both countries. And we're going to need to understand why before we get to this kind of unsettling dark truth about the economic differences between legal and illegal immigration. Okay, let's jump into this study. So this study is from the UK and there's one from the US. These are both from the federal budget offices. These are primary sources. They have excellent data on everything they are talking about. And before we make the argument of, well, we can't trust this data because they're not taking into account XYZ, I would, encourage you to look through it as you see when we go through it. These are very exhaustive studies. They are probably taking into consideration whatever it is you don't think they're going to. All right, this particular graph from the UK tells a lot of the story. So this black line is the representative UK resident. And if they're below this line, then the government has spent more money on this person than they have received in tax revenue. And if you're above it, it's the opposite. They've received more tax revenue than they've spent on the person. Now you can imagine your average UK person born in the country, until they're about 20, they're not being taxed much at all. They're not really paying anything in tax, and yet the government is spending on them for things like education and some healthcare things. But then they enter the workforce around 20 and you start to see them kind of claw back towards neutral, meaning they're starting to pay taxes into the system. And about halfway through their working age, around 45, they end up kind of hitting the neutral point where they have now kind of paid the government back for all of the money that they spent on them. And then as they work longer on towards retirement, that becomes positive. But then of course at retirement here in the US, they become eligible for things like Social Security and Medicare, and the net cost starts going back. And we would see that it hits neutral again around the lifespan of a human, around 80, 82 years, which makes sense. The government is not in the business of making money. They're in the business of bringing in revenue and then spending it on their population. So the average person should be neutral towards the end of their life. But these other lines are for migrants. So in particular, this green one is if the same person was a migrant and earned the average amount that a UK resident did, which by the way is about $36,000, I looked it up, similar to here in the US, then we didn't spend a bunch of money educating in healthcare because they generally move here around age 24. Now they move here at all sorts of ages, but the average age is about 24. So they start paying into the system through various taxes, and all of this understands whether these people here are legally, illegally, the split between them, what type of taxes they do pay or do not pay, which we'll see a lot when we get to the US study. So they work up, a substantial tax revenue to the government with very little benefits being spent on them when at retirement they start qualifying for all of those similar things. But the statistic I use in the intro is this yellow line, which is low income, which according to this is they're only earning 50% of average. So this is $18,000 in income a year, which is really not much. And at that levels of income, you really don't pay a lot of federal income tax. And because of that, they're almost immediately a burden because they're receiving some amount of benefits. And then, around retirement age, they start qualifying for other ones and it really becomes a drag. This is that right here, that $500,000 around end of life. So, from this limited picture, when you look at a single person, it appears that at a minimum, low-income migrants, which is a lot of the migrants that people are worried about right now, are a substantial drag on the economy. However, there's another side to this story, which is, and again, both of these are true for the US, even though that's a UK study, their population is very similar to us, their economy is very similar to us. So now we're going to look at it from like a federal budget standpoint. And in that standpoint, we're going to see why these numbers are the way they are. But this is what the budget office says is going to be the impact over the next 10 years from the immigrants that showed up through the immigration surge that was the last 3 to 4 years, although that surge really started in 2019, and we're going to see that in a minute. So from taxes paid over those 10 years, because the vast majority of people showing up are working age population, it's going to be about 800 billion. And then these changes in the economy, which is going to be very important, we're going to look at exactly what this is, about another 400 billion. So a total of about 1.2 trillion in increased revenue, and we're going to spend about 300 trillion because of these people on benefits that they receive from the federal government. So that's going to be a net impact of about 900 billion. This is a negative number because it's a decrease in the deficit. So this is a good number. The deficit is going to be better by almost $1 trillion because of it. But what is this kind of amorphous from changes in the economy, and how is it if we have a bunch of low-wage migrants coming that don't pay a lot of federal income tax? How do we get all this increased revenue? It kind of doesn't make sense, right? Well, that is best shown down here, which is this is all the key drivers of increases in nominal GDP, which is effectively just talking about the size of our economy, attributable to the immigration surge. And the biggest one here you're going to see is population. So I've done tons of videos about birth rates and population collapse. And specifically here in the US, we are in a situation where the number of working age people in the US has already leveled out and will most likely go down in the future. And immigration is one of the few sources of population that is preventing it from dropping even faster. And although you may be in a camp where you don't like a bunch of people in the US and there's already too many people and you don't want more people, from an economic standpoint, having your working age population starting to shrink is a huge problem. And thus, the 8 million people that have showed up through this immigration surge, the primary impact they're having is that keeping our population at a minimum level, and thus all of the increased activity because of that. So even whether they are legal or illegal, and we're going to see why they're coming in a minute, they are generating a ton of economic activity that is taxed through things like corporation taxes, state and local sales tax, things along those lines. So the fact that this migration surge is a source of population is a huge deal. It cannot be understated. As you can see, the impact, the size of it here compared to other things. But then there's this other part, labor force participation, which says it's not just that we had 8 million people show up. Because if 8 million people that have kind of standard demographics showed up, then that'd be like 2 million kids, 2 million retirees, and 4 million workers. Well, this is like 7 million of the 8 million are showing up at the perfect age for working. We'll see why in a minute. So this labor force participation says it's not just that population is showing up, the right kind of population is showing up, which is workers. So does this make sense, right? Do we need all these workers, which really comes down to why is this, surge happening? And you can blame whatever political scapegoat you want, whatever party, whatever president, but it's a pretty simple explanation for me, and I'm going to just use 2 simple graphs to show it. So this is apprehensions and expulsions by the U.S. Border Patrol from 1990 to 2023. I've done other videos about Border Patrol and funding, and this is not because they weren't looking for them during some of these times. But you can see this is where the surge that we're in now started. Here's 2019, kind of the first year that it was elevated. Now this is COVID 2020, so we can imagine if COVID went there, it probably would have been somewhere between 2019 and 2020, somewhere in here. So we see this major surge, and it has turned down, and even in 2024, the numbers are back down, and we'll see why. But, we went through this really time period of really low contact at the border. The border really wasn't an issue. So why all of a sudden in 2019 does it become an issue, right? This is the middle of the Trump presidency. And no matter what you think of Trump, you can't imagine that it was a welcoming time for immigration during this time. So why do we start to see it pick up then? And similarly, why was it higher before? Why do we see these 2 dips here that are very, they're not as low as this, but they're pretty low? Well, let's look at the unemployment rate over that time. Here we are. Now this is COVID, so this is, this giant jump is a little manufactured from the COVID experience, but you can see unemployment rates at historically low levels. And yet, from 2008, 2014, coming out of the global financial crisis, unemployment rate was the highest it has been since the early 90s. that just happens to perfectly correlate with the low time period when unemployment rate was really high and there were plenty of workers. And now unemployment rate is really low, largely due to these demographic shifts, the baby boomers retiring, the Great Resignation, all of this, where we see this surge. And then look back at this time period. While this was high in these two troughs in the early 2000s and the early 90s, oh, that happens to be, the early 2000s right here, or right here in the early 90s when unemployment rate was high and we didn't need workers, right? So, the argument can easily be made, the reason, one of many, that people are coming to the US in these big surges and why there are troughs and things is because of opportunities to work. And if the economy does not have those workers, there is a major drag on it. And that's why this population effect has such a major impact. All right, so we've kind of finally set the stage in terms of understanding this kind of dark truth that we're getting to about the difference between illegal and legal immigration on the budgets and the economies. And let's go back to this chart to start explaining it. Low-wage migrant, or just low-wage workers in general, don't pay a lot of income tax, right? Here in the US, if you earn below a certain level, you effectively pay no income tax. Now, you may pay payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare, but your income tax, which pays for all the other benefits, is very little. And low workers often use many of the benefits. So having a low-wage worker, whether they are a migrant or not, is generally a drag on the government. But they are paying payroll taxes for things like Social Security, and thus they are eligible for the benefits of those things. So it is actually better for them to be illegally here. Because they don't pay taxes, they are not eligible for the most expensive benefits that the federal government provides them, if that makes sense, right? It's actually a better deal for us not to receive the very small amount of federal taxes that they would have been paying if we don't have to pay them the expensive benefits that they would qualify for, right? And this is all through the US article here, which is when they show up, this study says, effectively now 65% of them are here unlawfully, and thus only eligible for child nutrition and emergency health care benefits. But by 2034, it's going to be only 40% of them are here illegally. But that still means 40% of them are illegally here. And that it goes all through how they become qualified for Social Security benefits and all of these things. But the longer they are undocumented workers, illegal, whatever you want to call it, the less of those benefits they accrue. And yet they are still paying or contributing to the economic activity that is causing this $1 trillion surplus in revenue. Things like, the taxation on the businesses they're working for that otherwise wouldn't have been able to hire employees because the unemployment rate is so low. There simply aren't enough people to hire. That's why they're coming in such large numbers. And the longer we delay putting them in the system, the better it is for the federal government because the less benefits they have to pay out. Now, eventually they do, although 40% in 10 years will still not be in the system and will not be accruing federal benefits, right? This has a huge impact, and this is not a secret, right? This is like all throughout these various studies, them addressing the fact about whether they are or are not qualifying for these various programs. Right now, down the road, and this takes into account like their kids that if they're born here will be U.S. citizens, or whether they're brought here illegally and aren't qualified for various things and along those lines. But you can see the major conflict in interest when studies like this come out from the various budgetary offices, and you see that it behooves the government to drag their feet on letting these people become legally working and then, the whole idea of whether we want them here or not is obviously mired in all of this as well. But this dark truth of it is better from a budget standpoint, to have illegal migrants versus legal ones is obviously a huge conflict of interest as we try and navigate through this. All right. I have done numerous videos about this this idea of population collapse and birth rates, which we talked about why it was so important, why how important these workers are coming. If you want to start from the beginning, this is the best video where I kind of cover that from a high level. And then I have numerous other videos that go into it in kind of various aspects of detail. So check out those videos. Stick around the channel for similar content, and I will talk to you soon.